Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wizard. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Kat Ellinger, it is a pleasure to talk to you today. I first discovered you on Arrow Video supplemental features, chatting about the 701 Scorpion series and Lucio Fulci. You have an eclectic taste, however, and exploitations are not the only type of films you are fond of. Please tell us why you personally like the films of Federico Fellini.
Oh, that's an easy one to start, isn't it?
We start off with some softballs.
King of the softballs, that's us.
I just love Fellini. Fellini, like you said, I'm quite eclectic in my tastes. But I do generally like very sort of, what's the word for it? Visually ornate sort of cinema, and I tend to gravitate towards the late 60s, early 70s. I like very lurid colours and sort of shiny things and all that. So there's that part of Fellini. But Fellini, to me, because he's one of my favourite filmmakers and definitely one of my favourite Italian filmmakers, along with Elio Petri and Vittorio De Sica, his films, even the ones that are really kind of surreal, like his later stuff, they're all about him. And he was like an eternal child. And he sort of, you can see a trajectory through his films. It becomes almost like an autobiography. So to know Fellini's films is to know Fellini. And I just love that sort of honesty in cinema. Although some of the later films on surface value, you know, the narratives, things like Fellini's Satyricon, the narratives are very fragmented and they don't seem to make much sense. You can always find some of Fellini in there. And so he had this very unique way of communicating with his audience on that level that's very human, very genuine. It's sort of the opposite of pretentious, which some of Fellini's imitators come off as. He was never pretentious. So I just kind of really respond to that honesty in his work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it does. It really does. Speaking of that kind of like internal element, one interesting and conflicting element of Italian cinema is the filmmaker's relationship with the church. And it's explored in many of Fellini's films, but I was going to ask specifically, Fellini helped write Roberto Rossellini's film, The Flowers of St. Francis. And do you think, if anything, it tells us about Fellini's earlier views on Christianity?
It does. Well, his views on Christianity never really changed, and it's interesting you brought that up because he kind of replicated parts of that in Juliet of the Spirits, which was his first colour film. But Fellini's relationship with the church was obviously a complicated one because he had a very strict Catholic upbringing. He grew up under fascism, and then through World War II, where you had this sort of Italian nationalism was tied in with the church. And so for Fellini, there was the other side of that, which was quite perverse, and it kind of turned him on. So he and a lot of films are about, Fellini's films are about sex as well, which I love. And he kind of had this sort of love-hate relationship with the church. In films like, I'm trying to think, Knights of Cabiria, he shows the church as this big spectacle, and he'd often compare the church and the media as well in his work. So it's evident there, even, you're right, in his writing. It's very early writing for Rossellini, but then it continues in his own work, and there's, you know, most of his films have some sort of religious significance as well. And just the fact that the Catholic Church had so much power over Italy. So for Fellini, you know, when he if you read his autobiography, he talks a lot about his sexual awakening, and he talks a lot about how the church had an impact on that. And so that's why he features a lot of prostitutes in his films, because to him they were the kind of ultimate forbidden fruit. So yeah, he had a very complicated relationship with religion, but I think it makes his films infinitely more wonderful because of it.
Oh yes, and Giulietta Messina was Fellini's wife from 1942 to 1991, and she dabbled in the occult. How pivotal do you think her influence was on Fellini's mysticism?
Oh, well, Fellini he had this, like, for Fellini again, he had this kind of lifelong vision where he had this relationship with Catholicism, but he also had a relationship with mysticism and the occult, because he saw Italy as kind of an old country, and his last film, Voice of the Moon, is all about that. It's all about listening to the spirits and listening to the voices of the past, and he saw Italy as a very magical place. And so he kind of had this sort of relationship with a kind of a folk religion. I wouldn't say it was pagan, but he definitely had a kind of interest in the past and mysticism and legends, and obviously Giulietta. I mean, she had a huge impact. She was his muse from the time they met, until he died, and then obviously she died shortly after. They were inseparable, and she was like his rock, that he'd go to, and they didn't always agree, but without Giulietta, I'm not sure his career would have been the same without the support of her. So she had a lot of influence on him. Not always. I mean, when they did Juliet of the Spirits, which was a film made for her, they didn't see eye to eye on it all the time, but, she did have a lot of influence over him in many ways. And incidentally, Juliet of the Spirits was the film that allowed him to then really heavily research these ideas of the occult and spiritualism and seances and all that. But you see it from that point onwards, it becomes more prominent in his films, this aspect of spirits and, occult ideas.
Yeah, it was actually funny. I was going to ask specifically about Juliet of the Spirits, we were going to get maybe caught on that spiritualism element. Can you maybe elaborate on how it evolves going forward from that point on?
I think because his films become more surreal, and what you find, it starts in things like La Dolce Vita in 8.5. 8.5 is I see 8.5 and Juliet as sort of two sides of the same coin. Even though Juliet of the Spirits is really supposed to be about Juliet, it's more about Fellini, but they're just his different sides. Around this time, he got very, very into Jung and the psychology of Carl Jung, and he got really into this sort of mystical thing. And so going forward from this point onwards, his films become more surreal. And what you find in the narratives is, and he does this in 8.5, but then he does it a lot more in Juliet, is you have sort of reality and unreality blurred together, and you have spirits coming back from people's past, or you have memories, like in Amarcord is all about memories, and you have this sort of, it's more of a stream of consciousness. And although it's not technically occult, it comes from this sort of Jungian psychology, I suppose, this belief that Fellini had, where he was also sort of, sorting out his own memories and recreating some of his own memories. So it's all tied into, although it might not necessarily be that obvious, it is all tied into this kind of mystical thing where we felt that we should be guided by our ancestors and we should be guided by the past. And, in Juliet you see actual ghosts of this woman's past, or they could be sort of schizophrenic visions, you're not really sure, they sort of appear. And you find that kind of thing turns up more. And then he made this swan song at the end, Voice of the Moon, which again is all about a man. He's mad, but he sees spirits. You see spirits of the past. And the last line of that film is all about listening and listening to the, if we just quieten down and we listened. And it means listening to the earth and listening to this sort of, this sort of spiritual kind of consciousness, I guess you'd call it.
Another thing that is big in Fellini's cinematic world is the circus. The Clowns is a very strange yet touching film of life in the carnival, and I believe it is most certainly a big influence specifically on Alejandro Jodorowsky's Santa Sangra. Do you feel this film has been neglected by audiences, perhaps?
It definitely has. It was made for Italian TV, and it's like... I think the stuff that he did for TV, I'm not sure if it's a rights problem or not, but they don't seem to have had the same... I know Clowns have actually had a Blu-ray release, but they just don't seem to have had the same attention on home video as the feature films that he made. So some of his sort of later works as well. like Ginger and Fred, and The Ship Sails On, things like that. I don't know if it's a rights issue, but they kind of sort of get neglected, the TV ones. But yeah, I mean, clowns again were a massive influence from a childhood experience where the legend goes he ran away with the circus, but what actually happened was he spent the day there and became enamoured with it. And he found clowns were very sad people, and you know, he didn't find them very funny, but he was enchanted by them. And so you see, he kind of recreates the circus in things like Juliet or the big parade at the end of 8½. He was always kind of making this sort of carnival atmosphere that comes from the circus. But it's a shame that it's a real shame that film in particular just tends to be ignored. I don't know why though. Maybe just because people are more interested in the sort of big feature films. They're the ones that get featured at retrospectives and get all the bells and whistles on Blu-ray. But I'm not sure why, because it's brilliant. So I don't know.
It always happens. Everyone's always got a pick for one of those movies, you know. But I was going to say, there's so many films about the creative process that really let you into the head of their creator. And of course, with Fellini, we have 8½. Where do you think that ranks with other movies on the subject?
Well, obviously, being a huge fan of Fellini, it's my favourite. I'm a bit biased. I just love it. I think it's like, because it's so surreal as well, and he really just addresses all sorts of things in his life, like his relationship with Juliet and the fact that he couldn't stay faithful to her. He addresses his relationship with his father and his mother, which were complicated as well, and just the fact, you know, all the stress he was under, because, you know, the story goes that, you know, he needed to write a film. Everyone was ready to go. Producers were ready to go. He wrote, and he just had writer's block. And so he wrote to the producer and just said, look, I'm not going to be able to do this. And just before he sent the letter, the idea came. So in that, it's like this emotional honesty. Again, he's like laying bare, you know, this is Fellini, who was a magician. Even Fellini is vulnerable to you know, creative block and to pressure and stress and all these things. And so although it's like the first of his films that becomes quite surreal, not as surreal as the later ones, but it is still quite surreal. It's very, very honest in how he sort of lays himself down really as a flawed human and you know, not perfect. He's not the Maestro Fellini. He's this flawed man who has affairs and, you know, can't get good ideas and so on and so forth. So I think that's why I love it so much, because it's just so honest.
Absolutely. So what are your thoughts on the cinematic disciples of Federico Fellini, and can anyone live up to such a rich legacy?
I don't know if anyone could ever live up to being, I mean, obviously there's so much cinema now that gets called Fellini-esque.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because, you know, he was so great that he actually had a word, like Fellini-esque. You don't get, like, Antonioni-esque or Pasolini-esque. You know, you just don't. But you get Fellini-esque because he created his own cinematic language, and it's kind of a pure cinema. It's very pure, and it's easily identifiable. And I think, you know, interestingly, my love for Fellini came from Terry Gilliam, from seeing Brazil, like when I was quite young, and I got the taste for that sort of cinema from that. And then later on I found Fellini and thought, God, you know, this is where this has come from. You know, this is amazing. So many people have been influenced by Fellini that it would be impossible to kind of list them all. Even people like Woody Allen, you know, was kind of, you know, channeling Fellini in Variety Nights. Not Variety Nights. Sorry, my mind has gone blank. What's it? Get this bit out. Oh, shit. What was the White Sheet, wasn't it? Yes.
What era?
Woody Allen, when he Woody Allen when he made Purple Rose of Cairo, which was another film that I loved when I was a kid. And then I saw Fellini's The White Sheet years later and realised it was just a bloody remake of that film. Not completely a remake, not scene for scene, but Woody Allen had obviously seen it and taken the ideas from it. So, but I don't think anyone could be Fellini because he puts so much of himself into his films that, you know, anything else becomes pretentious, I think. You know, unless a filmmaker just takes that influence, like, say, Woody Allen did, or Terry Gilliam, and then they make it their own. But then they're not Fellini either. They're like doing their own thing. So I don't think there ever will be another Fellini or anybody who could come close. You know, they'd have to do something completely different.
So I don't know too much, actually, about Fellini's later career. But I do know he did become less prolific, you know, as the late 70s and into the 80s. And I was wondering, historically, if there was one particular financial flop or a creative failure that got to him, or was there like a series of them, if you could kind of explain what happened?
No, it wasn't really that. No, not at all. I think, you know, from the early 70s, the Italian film industry was in crisis anyway. And so you see during this period the loosening of censorship, and you see things like the Giallo and, you know, the violent horrors coming out of Italy, and a lot more exploitation cinema. Whereas in the late 60s there was a lot of, you know, it was really strong, you know, Italian art films were selling really well internationally, and there was a lot of investment, and that started to drop off into the 70s. By the mid-70s, like, everybody was struggling to make films. And because you have things like the blockbuster come along, and, you know, Star Wars and things like that, and slasher films in the early 80s, and home video, so the whole industry was changing. And Italy was affected, obviously Britain was affected, a lot of Europe was affected by this. So it wasn't something that specifically happened to Fellini, because he did make, you know, from the mid-70s onwards, he did continue to make films, and made some of his best overlooked films, I think. Like I mentioned, The Voice of the Moon, which I think is a masterpiece. He also made Ginger and Fred, I think, late 80s, and Into Vista, which I don't know if you guys have seen them, but they're just incredible films. So he did continue, but a lot of his funding was coming from television rather than the film industry. And Into Vista is all about, actually, I think it was 87 or 88, Into Vista is all about his life at Cinecittà Studios and becoming a filmmaker, but it's kind of played out in a non-linear way. But it's also about how the studio was struggling and how the industry was struggling as a whole. So it kind of reflected that.
Do you think there's a specific kind of key that you can use to read these more surreal later Fellini films? Either a film of his or just kind of like another way you can look at it?
I think knowing Fellini makes the films a lot easier to understand. So anyone getting into Fellini, I'd say get his autobiography, I Fellini, and read it. Because everything you need to know is there. He followed very similar themes all the way through his work. So his relationship with his parents, his relationship with the church, his relationship with his creative process. Rimini, where he grew up, features highly. Sort of his time in, you know, growing up under fascism, his relationship to sex, you know, all of it is there, and the films just get more surreal, but those same themes are still there. As he got later on in his career with things like Ginger and Fred, he got a bit less surreal and more introspective. Ginger and Fred's about aging. It stars Giulietta Messina, and it's a beautiful film. It's kind of about it's about aging, and Into Vista as well. It's kind of like, you know, him reassessing his life as he was getting older. So the key really to understand any of his films is just to watch them and read what he had to say, because it's all in there. All his films, or most of his films, are about him. All his thoughts about Italy, the country that he loved, but he had a very complicated relationship with Italy as well.
Well, I'm going to find that autobiography. That's happening. And
it's amazing.
Yeah, it sounds
really
amazing. How could it not be?
Yeah.
It's the autobiography by Federico Fellini. It has to be amazing. So do you have, this is tough now, do you have a favorite and least favorite film by Mr. Fellini? Here we go.
No, no. It changes. It changes, and it changes all the time. Depends what mood I'm in, really. But there's no Fellini film Like even Variety Lights, which was the first one he did, which he co-directed with Alberto Latuada. I love it. I just love everything he made, even his like TV stuff. Like, you know, just
there's never like a stinker.
So beautiful, yeah.
There's no stinker.
I'd say if I had to really pick one, like, you know, you can only have one Fellini film, it would be The Strada, because that was my first, and that was what made me fall in love.
You never forget your first.
So, yeah. The Strada.
Well, Kat, obviously, thank you so much for this. It was very fun and informative, I think, for most people in Ottawa. And before we let you go, I want you to plug whatever you got coming up, whatever you can talk about. Tell everybody else about it.
Oh, my God. I have done something Fellini related recently, actually, though, but I don't think it's not been announced for a while, so I can't talk about that.
Bad.
My book on Daughters of Darkness, the Harry Kimmel film, 1971, is coming out soonish from Devil's Advocate. I'm doing loads of work with Arrow. I've just done a video essay for their What Have They Done to Your Daughters? What else? And just a video essay for their Joe D'Amato, Death Smiles on a Murderer.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's actually out now. I don't think Daughters is out just yet. What else? I've done loads of stuff. Footsteps in the Fog for Indicators. I was interviewed for that, so I did a piece on Gothic films, and obviously my podcast, my two podcasts, Daughters of Darkness and House Bowers, we've got episodes of those coming up soon. So yeah, really busy at the moment.
And you wrote
probably something really important I've forgotten now.
Of course, there always is, right?
I gotta say two things. You have a book called All the Colors of Martino, which is a great title.
I do, yes. And my book, yeah, I should have mentioned, yes, hello.
I'm here for you.
My book on Sergio Martino came out in January, but that seems so long ago now. And that's still available through Arrow. You can buy Arrow Films and Video.
Arrow Books. And Death Smiles on a Murder. If you guys are walking through the Rito Center, go to Sunrise Records. Death Smiles on a Murder is there. It's $45. And it is a classy movie by a sleazy director. It is worth the $45, I'd say.
And the restoration is beautiful.
Oh, yeah?
I've been watched it for years on bootlegs. The print of it is just gorgeous.
All right.
It completely changes, right?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll stay tuned to your very fun career. I love the visual essays. They're fantastic.
Thank you. And thanks for having me and letting me talk about Fellini.